News alert. I'm Bret Baier in Washington. You are looking live at the House floor where at this moment a vote is underway to end the government shutdown following a Senate vote earlier in the day. We're told the House leadership does have the votes needed to pass this and then send it to the president's desk. So the shutdown will be closed down in a matter of moments, but very little is actually resolved. Federal employees will go back to work, and a government viewed by many Americans as dysfunctional to begin with will resume functioning, at least for a couple more weeks. Senate Democrats abandoned their insistence on immigration legislation and agreed to end the three-day shutdown around noon today. Late this afternoon, the full Senate approved a stopgap spending bill, and that's what the House is voting on right now. But we could be back in the exact same situation during the first week of February. We have Fox team coverage tonight. Britt Hume has a big picture look at what this all means. Peter Doocy on Capitol Hill on dissension among Democrats over this truce with Republicans and what they got out of this deal. John Roberts at the White House with the president's role in all of this. But we start off with Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel at the Capitol to tell us where things stand at this minute. Good evening, Mike.
Brett, good evening. On day 3 of the government shutdown, Senate Democrats decided they'd had enough. Their leader, Chuck Schumer, signaled that right before a critical vote.
We will vote today to reopen the government, to continue negotiating a global agreement.
That led to an 81-18 procedural vote to fund the government for about 3 weeks, and bipartisan talks on the DACA issue would proceed.
With the commitment that, if an agreement isn't reached by February the 8th, the Senate will immediately proceed to consideration of legislation dealing with DACA.
Majority Leader Mitch McConnell jabbed at Schumer for pursuing a strategy of shutting down the government for an unrelated issue.
I think if we've learned anything during this process, it's that a strategy to shut down the government over the issue of illegal immigration is something the American people didn't understand.
The bill also includes a 6-year health insurance extension for an estimated 9 million children. A moderate Democrat up for re-election this year called the shutdown for immigration a mistake.
I wish we'd have never shut it down. There should have been a process. It should have been a no-brainer, but you have to go through some of this pain. I did not vote to shut down. I thought we should always be open and get to the point that we got to today. So we had a weekend of pain, and we're back open for business, and hopefully the Senate will do its job.
The basic deal is...
A bipartisan group of about 25 senators spent much of the weekend trying to figure out a way out of the impasse.
I was more negative last night, than I am today. I think we made some progress on some ideas about how to make sure we're moving forward on that long-term budget, while at the same time getting a vote on some bill that would protect the Dreamers from being deported.
Top House Republicans say they aren't bound by any Senate agreement and say Senate Democrats just wasted time.
Shutting the government down had slowed all those discussions. It's our intention to have it done. We want to make sure to solve this problem and not have it come back in another 2 years.
There were no commitments made in the House, and in fact, we've had a working group on immigration for a long time, but I think we've been very clear. Any final solution has to include funding for the wall.
After the shutdown, a colorful Senate Republican suggested some of his fellow lawmakers are too partisan and not very smart.
I think ardent Republicans probably think the Republicans are winning, and ardent Democrats think the Democrats are winning, and everybody else in America is kind of wondering how some folks up here made it through the birth canal.
February 8th is not much time, particularly in the typically slow-moving Senate. There must be some serious cooperation, or Congress could be back in a bad place soon. Brett?
Nothing like Senator Kennedy. Mike Emanuel live in the Hill. Let's take another live look at the House floor. We are being told now that you see the votes tallying up, 239 yays with 37 Democrats voting to pass this so far. Only a few seconds remaining in this vote. This has crossed the threshold of the votes needed to pass this. So the stopgap spending bill ending the government shutdown will be passed by the House when the gavel comes down in just a matter of seconds. And it will then go immediately to President Trump's desk, where he will sign it, and the government shutdown will officially be over. That is until February 8th or whatever day the standoff continues, the House passing this bill at this hour. Most Republicans are not coming out and saying it, spiking the ball, but many Democrats, especially progressives, say their leadership caved, and they are now making it known. They were not in favor of pulling the plug on the shutdown without something. Correspondent Peter Ducey is on the Hill tonight with that part of the story. Good evening, Peter.
Good evening, Brett. Most Senate Democrats ended up voting for this 3-week spending bill, even though they had been demanding a guarantee from Mitch McConnell that he address DACA next month, and they never got a guarantee. He said just that he intends to bring it up in a few weeks. So House Democrats are not happy.
We've decided that we could not go against our conscience and vote for a bill that hurts American people.
House Democrats are dumbfounded. Their colleagues across the Capitol caved.
I am a House Democrat, and I can tell you that there's no trust here on the House side because there's been none earned.
Illinois Congressman Luis Gutierrez says, quote, "This shows me that when it comes to immigrants, Latinos, and their families, Democrats are still not willing to go to the mat to allow people in my community to live in our country legally." Voting yes was deemed too toxic for 5 progressives rumored to have their eyes on the White House in 2020. Senators Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Kamala Harris all voted no. Harris, the California Democrat, then tweeted, quote, "The majority leader's comments fell far short of the ironclad guarantee I needed to support a stopgap spending bill. I refuse to put the lives of nearly 700,000 young people in the hands of someone who has repeatedly gone back on his word." But McConnell's word is good enough for longtime Vermont Senator Pat Leahy, even though Leahy voted no.
He has given his word he will. And so far, the only person who's stayed there for a shutdown and against the Dreamers is the president.
Most red state Democrats up for re-election ultimately voted yes on the 3-week-long spending bill. One did not. Montana Senator John Tester.
Just to cut right to the chase, I didn't vote for this because it's a bad deal for Montana. It has never been about DACA for me. It's been about making sure we have a budget that doesn't go a month or 3 weeks at a time.
Outside groups, which have been helping energize a base that now gives Democrats a 51 to 39-point advantage on a generic ballot in a Washington Post ABC News poll, are also steamed. MoveOn.org says, quote, "This is a bad, outrageous deal. Trump and Republicans in Congress stood with their anti-immigrant nativist base, and too many Democrats backed down, abandoned Dreamers, and failed to fight for their values." But prominent Democrats think those activists aren't appreciating the realities of being in the Senate's minority.
When you're in the U.S. Senate, you have a real good sense of what you can get and how. And look, I completely respect anybody who has a passionate belief about what should be done. But those of us who are here usually have a pretty good sense of how it should be done.
Republican senators that I've spoken to are saying that if Democrats weren't going to squeeze anything out of McConnell, they don't understand why Schumer didn't just make a deal before the shutdown. And a lot of liberals are wondering the same thing tonight. Bret.
Peter Ducey live on the Hill. Peter, thank you. President Trump is claiming victory tonight, perhaps not in so many words, but the administration's message is clear. He outlasted the Democrats. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts is here to tell us where we go from here. Good evening, John.
Brett, good evening. President Trump's strategy was to play a waiting game over the weekend, not talking to Democrats on the phone, no bipartisan negotiations, and in the end, he got precisely the result he was looking for. White House officials spiked the ball today, a clear win for President Trump after Chuck Schumer cut a deal this morning to accept everything President Trump offered him 3 days ago.
In regards to the government shutdown, we were pleased to see Senator Schumer accept the deal that President Trump put on the table from the very beginning, which was to responsibly fund the government and debate immigration as a separate issue.
The president himself weighed in a statement saying, "I am pleased the Democrats in Congress have come to their senses and are now willing to fund our great military, border patrol, first responders, and insurance for vulnerable children." The shutdown history, the White House now turns its focus back to forging a deal on the so-called Dreamers. White House sources say they had been making progress in negotiations, Democrats moving a bit on wall funding, the White House agreeing there may be thousands more people than previously acknowledged who are eligible for DACA status.
We're happy to continue discussions. We feel like we're making progress on the immigration issue. We feel there's been substantial progress.
But the White House made it clear today, any deal on the Dreamers has to satisfy the president's 4 principles: fix DACA, end chain migration, end the visa lottery program, and build the wall.
We know that that's going to be part of this negotiation. That's something the president has committed to do, but we don't want to do that without the other three components. It's like having a stool with two legs. It doesn't work very well.
To hear Senator Lindsey Graham tell it, the problem with reaching a deal on DACA can be pinned to the president's staff, in particular Chief of Staff John Kelly and Senior Domestic Policy Advisor Stephen Miller. Both are hawks on immigration and shot down the deal Graham and Senator Dick Durbin brought to the president 2 Thursdays ago. Graham was particularly sharp on Miller.
The reason we yanked these things back is because Mr. Miller, I've known him for a long time. I know he's passionate. I know he's an early supporter of the president. But I'll just tell you, his view of immigration has never been in the mainstream of the Senate.
Graham said Miller is an outlier on immigration, prompting White House spokesman Hogan Gidley to flip the script in a statement saying of Graham, he's been an outlier for years. Gidley tagged in the press secretary who drove the knife home.
It is almost appalling to me that you have a senator that isn't stepping up, doing the right thing. The fact that he's not part of the conversation to help move that ball forward and is instead attacking individual members of the president's staff, I think shows the lengths of what they're going to blame people for their own failures.
And the White House today defended a tough new immigration ad put out by the Trump campaign. It charges Democrats who don't support new border security measures will be complicit in crimes committed by illegal aliens.
Democrats who stand in our way will be complicit in every murder committed by illegal immigrants.
The press secretary saying today the president's #1 priority is the safety of the American people. Before the House and Senate even began voting on the continuing resolution, President Trump was back here at the White House conducting negotiations on DACA, meeting with Senators Cornyn, Cotton, Langford, Perdue, Grassley, Tillis, Manchin, and Doug Jones. And we should point out, Bret, that's the first meeting that he's had with the newly minted senator from Georgia.
John Roberts live on the North Lawn. John, thanks. Moments ago, the House gavelled in the official numbers, and that is 266 yeas, 150 noes. 45 Democrats voted yay for this bill that now heads to the president's desk over at the White House to sign it. Let's get some perspective now from senior political analyst Bret Hume. Good evening, Bret. Your thoughts on all of this today as it played out?
Well, I was not sure I would ever see the day when Democrats lost a shutdown fight. Everyone I've ever covered, going back, several decades, no matter who was actually at fault, the Republicans got the blame. And it didn't happen this time, which is quite remarkable. And what is also remarkable is how little, if anything, that Senator Schumer got in exchange for giving in on all this, agreeing to end the filibuster and let the bill pass. The bill always had the votes to pass. So this is a remarkable turnabout, and it may be, Bret, it may be that we have now reached a stage where using the threat of a government shutdown or an actual shutdown to gain leverage on an unrelated issue won't work anymore. It is something I think most Americans could hope for.
For all the grief that conservatives on the right side of the party give to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, it seems like he played this the right way from the beginning. Is that fair?
I think it is fair, and while it is certainly true, as John Roberts reported, the White House is saying that the president ended up in a good place as far as what his priorities are. It's worth remembering that over this weekend, which I think was critical to all of this, when the discussions were going on mostly on Capitol Hill, that the president, wisely in my judgment, took a seat on the sidelines and let this play out on the Hill, where Senator McConnell and the Republicans were able to bring about this result. In no small part, I suspect, because the polls, while they still favor the Democrats on the issue, were beginning to turn, and I suspect Democrats saw that. I also would say, Bret, that for Democrats up for election this year, some in red states, carried by Mr. Trump, this is an uncomfortable position to be in, and I'm sure their influence had something to do with the outcome. But McConnell kind of stuck to his guns here. He really didn't offer them very much, and he got what he wanted. You put that together with a tax bill, and perhaps some of his critics within the Republican and conservative ranks will begin to think more highly of him than they have heretofore.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned those Senate Democrats up for re-election in red states, states that Trump won. One of them, John Tester, voted against this deal, stopping the shutdown, and others voted for it. But the progressives of the party, Think Progress, say Democrats cave. Progressive Change Campaign Committee, why people don't believe the Democratic Party stands for anything. America's Voice, tears of disappointment and anger. These are all things that the Republicans now are sending out to all of their voters.
Well, Bret, this is a mirror image of what happened back in 2013. You remember when Ted Cruz, who was acting as kind of a Pied Piper for conservative members of the House, was able to get them to try to shut down the government in order to undo Obamacare. It failed quite spectacularly. The leadership in the Republican Party was against it, but it went forward anyway, and it was a spectacular failure, after which it was argued by people who were for the whole idea of trying to do this, that if they just hung in there, if the Republicans had just stuck to their guns, if Ted Cruz in the end hadn't caved, all would have worked out very well. Well, you're hearing the same thing exactly from the left about Senator Schumer. The Republicans, you may recall, were calling this the Schumer shutdown. And now some on the left, as the remarks you just read suggest, are calling it the Schumer sellout. I suspect this will stick with him for a while.
Bret, as always, thank you. Wall Street approved of what happened today, with all three major markets hitting new record highs. The Dow surging 143. The S&P 500 was up 23. The Nasdaq skyrocketed 72. Again, all record highs once again. Up next, outrage tonight over missing text messages involving FBI officials Republicans claim were biased against the president in the investigation. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 25 in Oklahoma City, as 5 people are missing following an explosion at an oil drilling rig in eastern Oklahoma. About 17 others have been rescued. It happened this morning near the town of Quinton, about 100 miles southeast of Tulsa. One official says simply, pretty much everything on site is on fire. Fox 13 in Tampa, as authorities search for a person of interest after what the FBI says were 2 marine flares ignited inside a mall in Central Florida. No one was hurt, fortunately, and the damage was minimal. The Bureau says there is no indication of an explosion. And this is a live look at Seattle from our affiliate, Q13 Fox. One of the big stories there tonight, Amazon opens its artificial intelligence-powered Amazon Go store downtown Seattle. The store is on the bottom floor of the company's Seattle headquarters, and it allows shoppers to scan their smartphone with the Amazon Go app at a turnstile, pick out the items they want, and leave. No cashier required there. The bill is charged to the shopper's Amazon account. Could that be the future? We'll see. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back. This is a Fox News alert. Lawmakers are going over several hundred pages of newly released texts between 2 former members of the team run by the special counsel investigating Russian collusion. But getting most of the attention tonight is what they are not seeing. Here's Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Harris with the latest. Good evening, Catherine.
Well, thank you, Bret. Late today, Fox News obtained a statement from Attorney General Jeff Sessions confirming that 2 FBI officials sent more than 50,000 text messages over a 2-year period. The Justice Department's internal watchdog, the Inspector General, is now investigating whether the missing records can be recovered and whether their disappearance was deliberate.
Of course, we need a second special counsel to get to the bottom of to get to the bottom of all this and answer the many questions we have.
Congressional Republicans are calling out the FBI after learning 5 months of text messages between 2 key bureau officials in the Clinton email and Russia investigations are missing. The text messages between FBI agent Peter Strzok and his then mistress, FBI lawyer Lisa Page, range from December 2016, 1 month after President Trump's election, to May, when then FBI Director James Comey was fired and special counsel Robert Mueller took over the Russia case. According to this letter from Senator Ron Johnson, who chairs the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee, the FBI blamed a technical problem for the Bureau's failure to capture and preserve the records.
People either need to be terminated or prosecuted, because they may say they've lost these things, but I don't think Verizon or AT&T or any of the other phone companies have lost those records.
The nearly 400 pages of text provided to Congress suggests then Attorney General Loretta Lynch knew the FBI would recommend against prosecution before Hillary Clinton's July 2, 2016 FBI interview about mishandling classified information. 4 days after Lynch met with Bill Clinton on an Arizona tarmac where they claimed to discuss grandchildren, and 1 day before Hillary Clinton's FBI interview on July 1st, 2016, Strzok tells Page, "Timing looks like hell, will appear to be choreographed." Page agreed and later replied, "It's a real profiling courage since she knows no charges will be brought." The texts appear to undercut Comey's July 2016 claim that he acted alone when recommending against criminal charges.
I have not coordinated this statement or reviewed it in any way with the Department of Justice or any other part of the government.
In a separate development over the weekend, the Republican chairman of the House Intelligence, Judiciary and Oversight Committees met behind closed doors to discuss the next steps for the 4-page memo that alleges government surveillance abuses during the 2016 election. A senior Democrat says the memo omits key details and the findings are exaggerated. Bret.
Just doing the math here, 50,000 texts over 2 years. That averages out to 68.5 texts per day. 68.5. This is in a crucial time period.
Look, that 5-month window really covers some of the big events. And one lawmaker said to me today, if Strzok and Page had the so-called insurance policy, this is when there would be evidence that it was implemented in some way. After the president was elected, during the transition when he's briefed on the dossier, Flynn's interview by Strzok as part of the Russia case, then the firing of Comey and the appointment of the special counsel. I mean, these are the big pillars of this investigation.
We'll see if someone has those texts, and we'll stay on it. Catherine, thank you.
You bet.
The Pennsylvania Supreme Court has struck down the boundaries of the state's 18 congressional districts just months before the midterm elections. That is a major victory for Democrats who had contended the districts were unconstitutionally gerrymandered to benefit Republicans. GOP leaders say the state court overstepped its legal authority. They plan to ask the U.S. Supreme Court to intervene. Now to a follow-up on a story from last week about how one government office is requesting exactly nothing, nada, no additional money at all to keep running the next few months. Correspondent Kevin Corke tells us from the White House it could be the beginning of the end for an already unpopular place in the administration's eyes.
As agency shakeups go, it was more earthquake than tremor. Mick Mulvaney, acting director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, so said the headlines, requests no money for the agency. But the headlines also ignored Mulvaney's broader mission, say White House officials, to reshape an agency that's been awash in controversy since its inception in 2011 in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. For the record, the CFPB had $177 million on hand to begin the fiscal year, but needs only about $145 million to cover its operating expenses for the quarter. That, according to the White House, is why Mulvaney requested no additional money for the second quarter. A major departure from his Obama administration predecessor, who asked for $217 million for the fiscal first quarter of 2018. The belt tightening, a byproduct of a top-to-bottom review of the agency, about which Mulvaney once famously said,
"It turns up being a joke," and that's what the CFPB really has been, in a sick, sad kind of way.
Not surprisingly, critics view his sudden federal altruism with great skepticism, arguing the former congressman from South Carolina simply opposes the fact that the Bureau's budget comes from the Fed and thus is not subject to congressional appropriation oversight. Mulvaney, for his part, says it simply caused a lack of accountability. That, following a legal battle between Mulvaney and former Assistant Director Leandra English over who could appoint the agency's leadership. President Trump, who the courts decided gets to make that call, said the Bureau was a total disaster, adding that financial institutions have been devastated. Proponents say the CFPB has done right by Americans, providing billions in debt relief and refunds, often at the expense of banks. But financial institutions say it's simply been far too aggressive. And now with Acting Director Mulvaney at the helm, they say the timing's right for a regulatory redo. Bret?
Kevin Corke in the White House briefing room. Kevin, thanks. Vice President Pence announces a quicker timeline for the new U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, stirring up some anti-American feelings in the Middle East. We'll head there. Saudi Arabia is pumping another $1.5 billion into aid for war-ravaged Yemen. The kingdom deposited $2 billion into Yemen's central bank last week. Saudi Arabia has been leading a coalition of 9 Arab countries in airstrikes against Iran-backed Yemeni rebels and their allies for almost 3 years. The United Nations is calling the Yemen situation the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Vice President Mike Pence is in Israel tonight after a rousing welcome today by Israeli lawmakers. Pence says the U.S. Embassy move to Jerusalem will come sooner than expected. And while Israel, of course, celebrates, Palestinians and their allies condemn the U.S. policy. Correspondent David Lee Miller is traveling with the Vice President in Jerusalem tonight.
Mike Pence is the first U.S. Vice President to speak before Israel's parliament, the Knesset.
I am here to convey a simple message from the heart of the American people. America stands with Israel.
The Vice President was interrupted numerous times for applause and once by Arab members of the parliament who held up signs declaring Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine. They had to be forcibly removed. Mr. Pence received a standing ovation when he revealed the details of when the U.S. Embassy would be relocated from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, Israel's capital.
In the weeks ahead, our administration will advance its plan to open the United States Embassy in Jerusalem. And that United States Embassy will open before the end of next year.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who joined Mr. Pence this evening for dinner, congratulated him on his speech before Parliament.
It was a powerful expression of the enduring bond between our two countries.
The Palestinian leadership boycotted Mr. Pence because of the U.S. position on Jerusalem. A Palestinian lawmaker accused the vice president of using his religion to set diplomatic policy.
He brought to bear his ideological fundamentalist literalist interpretation of the Bible in order to punish the Palestinians and reward the aggressor, the Israeli occupier.
On Sunday, while in Amman, Mr. Pence met with U.S. ally Jordan Kings Abdullah, who called for Jerusalem to be the capital of a Palestinian state. Mr. Pence reaffirmed the U.S. takes no position on boundaries and final status.
As I've made clear to you and the President made clear to the world, the United States of America remains committed, if the parties agree, to a two-state solution.
On another subject, speaking before Israel's parliament, Vice President Pence called the Iranian nuclear deal negotiated by the Obama administration a disaster. He pledged that the United States will never allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. Bret.
David Lee Miller live in Jerusalem. David, thank you. The Vice President talks with Shannon Bream tonight on Fox News at night. You can see it at 11 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll play a clip of this with the panel. The federal government is ordering additional screenings of cargo on U.S.-bound flights from 5 Middle Eastern countries. The TSA is citing terrorist threats to aviation. The countries are Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. TSA says most of the requirements of the emergency order are already being carried out voluntarily by airlines in some of those countries. Survivors from this weekend's terror attack on a hotel in Afghanistan's capital are describing a reign of terror that lasted more than a dozen hours and left more than a dozen people dead. Correspondent Benjamin Hall shows us what happened.
Explosions and gunfire echoed across Kabul Saturday night as Taliban gunmen in Afghan police uniforms attacked the Intercontinental Hotel, looking for foreigners to kill. The standoff lasted 13 long hours and claimed 18 lives. Among the killed, people from Ukraine, Venezuela, Greece, Germany and Kazakhstan. Desperate guests used bedsheets to climb out of windows as the 6 terrorists who had bypassed 4 security checkpoints went hunting room to room, laying explosives. More than 150 people were eventually rescued, including 41 foreigners, when security services were finally able to kill the attackers. Survivors recounted the deadly ordeal.
A suicide bomber came to my door and opened fire, but luckily he didn't enter the toilet where I was hiding. The room next to mine caught fire, either from a hand grenade or other explosives.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson condemned the attack, saying, quote, "We have seen the Taliban's claim of responsibility and condemned terrorist groups for their violent campaign." U.S. officials say the Taliban has been forced onto its back foot since the U.S. stepped up airstrikes, but security remains precarious. In fact, just days before Saturday's attack, the State Department warned that extremists were likely to target Western hotels in the Afghan capital. While the Taliban did indeed claim this attack, Afghan officials pointed the finger at the Haqqani network, which is based principally in Pakistan, again raising the issue of whether Pakistan is providing safe havens for militants. NATO hoped that 2018 is the year when the Afghan government starts to take back more territory from the Taliban. But officials also fear that as battlefield pressure increases, attacks like this on high-profile targets are also likely to increase. Bret?
Benjamin Hall in London. Benjamin, thank you. Who won and who lost? The shutdown ends and Democrats come up empty on immigration. We'll talk about it all with the panel when we come back. First, though, beyond our borders tonight, Venezuela's financial crisis appears to be getting worse, much worse. The Washington Post reporting the country's economy is experiencing what is known as hyperinflation, where money is virtually worthless. The opposition-run Congress says inflation topped 2,600% last year. President Nicolas Maduro's plan to introduce a new cryptocurrency backed by the nation's oil reserves has run into significant opposition. Turkish troops and tanks are advancing on a Kurdish enclave in northwestern Syria for a third day. The Turks are seeking to oust a U.S.-backed Kurdish militia from that area. The operation is raising tensions in the already complicated Syrian conflict and threatening to further strain ties between Turkey and the U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis says Turkey did give the U.S. advance notice of its airstrikes in that area. Former UN Ambassador Bill Richardson met today with Burma's leader to discuss the potential return of Rohingya Muslim refugees. About 700,000 fled their homes in response to what was called military clearing operations following attacks by a militant group on police in August. Others have called that campaign ethnic cleansing. Just some of the other stories beyond our borders tonight. We'll be right back.
We will vote today to reopen the government, to continue negotiating a global agreement, with the commitment that, if an agreement isn't reached by February the 8th, the Senate will immediately proceed to consideration of legislation dealing with DACA.
I think if we've learned anything during this process, it's that a strategy to shut down the government over the issue of illegal immigration is something the American people didn't understand.
Government shutdown will be officially over tonight. The bill from Congress making its way to the White House, the president's signature, and then that's it. The president issuing a statement today. I'm pleased that Democrats in Congress have come to their senses and are now willing to fund our great military, Border Patrol, first responders, and insurance for vulnerable children. As I have always said, once the government is funded, my administration will work towards solving the problem of very unfair illegal immigration. We will make a long-term deal on immigration if and only if it is good for our country. Now look at some of the coverage of this just by Twitter. New York Times, Democrats surrender. Not sure I understand the point of the last 3 days. Boston Globe. Democrats have managed to accede to Republican demands, demoralize their energized base, give a disengaged president a win, and look like they held a meaningless 3-day government shutdown all at once. Washington Post, we now await Democrats' spin about how this isn't a cave. The president did, as you saw there, meet with 6 Republican senators at the White House and 2 Democrats talking about immigration today. There you see the Republicans and the Democrats. 2 red state Democrats, Joe Manchin and Doug Jones from Alabama. Let's bring in our panel. Jonah Goldberg, senior editor at National Review, Matt Schlapp, contributor with The Hill, and Jonathan Swan, national political reporter for Axios. So there's a lot of confidence at the White House that this went how they wanted it to go. What's your breakdown, Jonathan?
I think short term, it's a pretty clear victory for them, and you outlined why. But I think long term, it's pretty dangerous, actually, because this isn't really a great legislative victory. This is basically an agreement to a process. Then we have 3 weeks, and then we're back at the table. And what we know from looking at the Senate and observing the Senate over the last number of months is that this is not a Senate capable of passing a hardline immigration bill that's going to appeal to Trump's base. So the calculation inside the White House right now is it going to be enough if the Democrats give us X billion dollars for something that we can call a wall. Is that going to satisfy the people who elected Donald Trump on this very hardline position on immigration? There's no way they're going to get the chain migration and all these other things that Stephen Miller has on his wish list. It's just not going to happen.
Matt?
I disagree with Jonathan. I actually think this is a huge change in events. You know, I was a staffer in Congress during the 1996 budget showdown and the shutdown. And Republicans learned two things in dealing with Bill Clinton. Don't investigate too aggressively, because I thought they lost on that, and don't have these spending fights and don't have these showdowns. What Donald Trump has done in coordination with Mitch McConnell is actually make Republicans believe that they can actually win a spending fight and do it in 3 days. This is going to change the dynamics in Washington. Is it easy to get an immigration bill done? No, we haven't done it for 25 years. It's going to be tough to get an immigration bill done. But this sets the table and puts the Republicans in a stronger position they've been on spending questions than in a generation.
All right, and we heard Bret Hume say he doesn't remember one that went the Republicans' way.
Right.
Shut down. Take a listen to the House Speaker about their sense of this.
There are no winners here today. I want to make that clear. This is not a moment to pat ourselves on the back, not even close. We very much need to heed the lessons of what just happened here.
We have 10 1/2 days left before we have another crisis in funding our government. Let us try to use every one of those days to reach agreement on funding the government.
Politically, in the short term, you had people like John Tester up for re-election in Montana voting against this. You have Dianne Feinstein, who likely will face a primary in California, saying that she was very disappointed in the deal to end the shutdown, saying from the left that Schumer had caved.
Yeah. I spent most of the afternoon thinking, very much like Matt did, that this was a big victory for Republicans. I'm moving much more in Jonathan's direction towards the end of the day. To answer your question first, though, the Democrats are in a position, it's a weird sort of Twilight Zone remake of 2013, where the argument across big swaths of the right, particularly talk radio right, was all you have to do is fight, power of the purse, 40 senators can do whatever they want, we can shut down the government. And now you have, either because of people like Dianne Feinstein are being primary challenged, or people who are planning on running for president, like Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, you have a bunch of Ted Cruzes on the Democratic side. And I think one of the things that this has done is, I'm not sure it's demoralized the left-wing base of the Democratic Party. I think it's put a lot of them into sort of Tea Party mode, where they're all declaring war on the establishment. They're all declaring war on the guys who sold them out. Now, getting back to your first question, though, the Republicans gave Democrats one of the things they wanted, and they did it without any strings attached. 6 years of funding for CHIP with no reforms whatsoever. That is one less inducement to get Democrats to vote for whatever they come up with by February 8th. And you have now a situation where we could go through all of this all over again, and the Republicans have fewer bargaining chips, and the Democrats have every incentive now, if Mitch McConnell doesn't come through with bringing something forward, of shutting down the government again. Again, I think short term, Republicans won this messaging. I agree with Bret Hume. Long term, I think this might set up some interesting dynamics.
But weren't they getting closer? Weren't they on an immigration, back and forth? I mean, depending on what you believe, what the president said and what Schumer said inside the White House.
Look, a couple things. First of all, on the Democratic question, this shutdown strategy was a disaster. Let's be clear. Going back to it, I'd love it if they would do that. That'd be great. On immigration, you're right. We know the four things that have to be in the bill. If there's anybody who can get to a deal with hardliners on the conservative side, it's Donald Trump. If you look at the statements from hardline immigration groups on the idea of putting these four things together, they're willing to go along and see what that product is. We have a chance to do this in this country. Donald Trump's the only one who can get it done.
The question is whether that Tuesday cabinet bipartisan meeting with Congress, where I'll take the heat, whether he really will.
Well, see, the problem is passing what he actually means by that, because in that same meeting, Feinstein said, we want a clean DACA bill, and Trump goes, great. And then McCarthy has to sort of step in and say, well, no, actually, we need some border security with it. And that's half the problem with these negotiations, is because people come in, and it's just the nature, it's just the way Trump talks. He talks in fairly loose, sort of high-level phrases. So you have people coming out of the room with different ideas of what it means, and then it comes back to square one, which is you have fairly hardline staff in the White House, like Stephen Miller and John John Kelly saying, no, this is what we need. They're in coordination with Cotton and Perdue. Then you have people like Jeff Flake and Lindsey Graham who, frankly, I think Jonah pointed this out in the green room, they shouldn't be regarded as Republicans in this negotiation. They're basically Democrats on this issue. They are completely in keeping with Dick Durbin and the others that they're negotiating with. So the idea that original bill was bipartisan was a fantasy. So it's just a very, very difficult issue.
It's
as
difficult.
Matt worked out. There's
it's
no
difficult
question.
but doable.
Senator Graham, Jonah's email is...
what happens in the green room stays in the green room. My God!
Yeah, we'll teach him. We'll teach him. Next up, the Vice President in Israel. Lots of strong emotion on a number of things. Stay with us.
In the weeks ahead, our administration will advance its plan to open the United States Embassy in Jerusalem. And that United States Embassy will open before the end of next year.
The sooner the Palestinians accept the truth about the millennial connection of the Jewish people to this land and to this city, the sooner we can work together to reach an historic agreement.
We are determined to reunite our people and our land in order to bring about a single and unified state, a single and unified legislation, and a single legitimate army. This will make it possible for the state to exist with the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem as a capital.
Vice President Pence in Israel, speaking to the Israel Parliament, the Knesset, and saying we're going to speed up the timeline on moving this embassy to Jerusalem. We're back with the panel. Jonathan, the hopes and dreams of a big Middle East peace deal, it seems pretty tough to get across the finish line.
Well, it's kind of bizarre because you've got the White House team, and it's a very small team, Jared Kushner, the ambassador, Jason Greenblatt, working on this deal. We haven't seen it. We haven't heard any details. It's been the most leak-proof operation in the White House. And they say that they're continuing to work on this deal in this sort of vacuum almost, because you've got the Palestinians out there publicly saying, well, go jump in a lake, we won't deal with you. So we're going to find out sooner or later. At some point, they're going to release this deal. And at some point, we're going to find out whether the Palestinians are bluffing or whether they're actually willing to engage with what's on that document.
Matt?
I think Middle East peace is, I'll agree on this one. That's an awfully tough goal to get to. How about some security? How about people taking the American president's word for what it is? And how about folks realizing that when we draw a line in the sand on Iran getting a nuclear weapon, that we mean it? And I think if we can accomplish those things, I think we've gotten a lot done in the region.
Speaking of Iran, here is Shannon Bream asking the Vice President about Iran.
Today, in your speech at the Knesset, pretty heavy, tough words on Iran. So where do we go from here, and what partnership do we have with those in this region that will make a difference?
The last thing that we want to see after driving ISIS out of Iraq and literally on the cusp of driving ISIS out of existence in Syria is to see Iran and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard fill that vacuum. And the United States of America and our allies are simply not going to let it happen.
You can see that interview tonight, 11 p.m. Eastern Time. He also said that the United States will no longer certify this ill-conceived agreement, the Iran deal, and that will never allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, no, look, I think what ties all of this together, for years people refer, when they say the Middle East conflict, they think it means about Israel. We have Middle East conflicts all around the region that Israel is no part of. Events are moving past the Palestinians. The real drivers of change are in Saudi Arabia, to a lesser extent Tehran, and events are passing by the Palestinians as Israel and the United States move forward on this. Mahmoud Abbas, I think, is in the 13th year of his first 4-year term, and what you see is just simply that, for good or for ill, the Trump administration is simply moving past these old paradigms, and a lot of the Middle East is going with it, and it's leaving these people who are locked into these old systems in the dust.
Lastly, how's he going to be received at Davos?
Trump? Oh, I mean, there's, his collection of enemies in the crowd. It's the global elite that he campaigned against. But, Trump has got some good personal relationships with some of these people. Macron, in particular, has been encouraging him to go to Davos. So it's not all, animosity, but a lot of these people are, in favor of all the things that Donald Trump campaigned against.
Panel, as always, thank you. When we come back, the Philly Fanatics. Finally, Finally tonight, the Eagles and the Patriots are officially in the Super Bowl. Super Bowl 52 in Minneapolis, February 4th. And Philadelphia fans took celebrating to a whole new level last night. Workers dubbed Crisco cops greased light poles in preparations for the celebration. Why, you say? Well, you'll see. Fans also climbed statues and celebrated on the streets. One driver even taking a dune buggy up the rocky steps at the Philadelphia Art Museum. But the video that's getting the most attention is this one. A fan who missed the train to the game instead, oh no. Oh, slow-mo. Slamming right into that pole. And it wasn't greased. Thanks for inviting us into your home tonight. That's it for this special report. Fair, balanced, and unafraid.